Hello guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Path of Exile 2 Skills. So today we're going to be looking at a spell, specifically one that I've used a lot in a lot of different characters. I'm trying to get some of the abilities that I've really experimented with myself out of the way. This one in particular is a skill known as Frost Bomb. Let me empty out my inventory real quick because I'm going to need the space.
Don't spend it all at once.
Poopies.
Carry on.
Bing, 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 bing. Alright, so when you use Frost Bomb is really simple. In fact, let me take out Spell Cascade and Spell Echo so that you can see it in its raw form. So when you use or Frost Bomb, it creates a bomb which pulses multiple times. Now it's important to note that it doesn't do any damage. It does no damage whatsoever when it is pulsing. It only does damage upon the final explosion. I actually have built an entire character around this ability, and the ability that I built was kind of fun. I basically set it up so I could just have like multiple frost bombs exploding like in rapid succession. That was really cool. They had since, unfortunately, put a limit on frost bomb, made it a lot harder to spam. Probably my fault. But you know, it is what it is. When it comes to Frost Bomb, however, on the Gemling Legionnaire, you can actually get some special bonuses. So the Gemling Legionnaire has a passive that allows him to get extra quality bonuses. And one of the extra quality bonuses he gets is, you guessed it, Limit Frost Bomb. Which is really freaking cool. So you can essentially get more of a limit to the number of frost bombs that you can put out at any given time period, which means I can put out 3 frost bombs. However, it has a cooldown on it, which makes it more difficult to put out those frost bombs. Let's take a look at the ability. Let's read it real quick. Let's talk about it, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how you can take advantage of this ability to 100%. So it's an AoE skill, which means it does scale with AoE damage multiplier modifiers. It is cold, it's duration, it is a orb, and it is also a remnant skill because it creates elemental remnants called cold infusions, which are really cool. And I'll talk about what you can do with those later. It has mainly intelligence as its requirement, so if you don't have high intelligence, it will not work. Another thing that they changed about this ability is that if you are using a lower level version of the skill, it will not work because the elemental exposure only works if the monster is within a certain number of levels. It's actually written right here. It says exposure is a type of debuff that lowers the affected enemy's total enemy resistance. By default, it lowers resistance by negative 20% and lasts for 4 seconds. Though some sources of exposure can override these values, like most sources of lowering resistances, this can cause the enemy's resistance to become negative. Higher rarity enemies are less affected by exposure. 15% less exposure on magic monsters, 30% less on rare monsters, and 50% less on unique. Also, if the monster is not within a certain number of levels of the skill, it will unfortunately not work on the target either. So if you're using a low-level version of Frostbomb on high-level monsters, it just will not apply. It just won't apply at all, so keep that in mind. Now, elemental exposure is one of the main reasons why you come to Frostbomb because it stacks ridiculously. You can stack elemental exposure using things like potent exposure, which gives you 20% increased effective exposure. You can utilize, obviously, the level of the ability, which gives you more and more every single time. In fact, you can see here it says initially applies 20% elemental exposure and 2% exposure per pulse, up to a maximum of 50%. However, you'll see that mine is going a lot higher than 50. You can also get more elemental exposure on the board if you take a look at it. So like there's a bunch of exposure nodes that you can take to increase the amount of exposure. Right here is a 5% additional resistance. There's also 10% increased exposure effect, 10% increased exposure effect. You can also come up here and there's 30%, 10%, and 10%, all of which will give you even more exposure on your character. So if you stack these exposure effects, you essentially get more and more negative res, which of course negative res is increased damage because as you know from Diablo 2, as the monster's resistance drops, especially below 0 into the negative numbers, it's essentially just free multiplicative damage on your character. Like if you were doing 10,000 damage and you have negative 100% resistance, well now you're doing 20,000 damage because it's a 100% increase on what you had before. That's one of the main reasons why you come to Frostbomb. Now, a second reason that you would come to Frostbomb is, of course, its ability to create these elemental infusions, which in this particular case, it creates a cold infusion. Every time you use Frostbomb and it successfully explodes, it will create one of these little ditties on the ground. And when you walk close to it, it will collect it and give you the cold infusion. The cold infusion is going to give you a nice buff on a particular skill that you would use it on. So depending on what you are using the cold infusion for, which there's a lot of fun things that you can use it on, we'll go over that in a minute. You can stack these. You can also stack more of them, and you can also create more of them. So Frostbomb is an ability that is cascadable, it is echoable, and if you have a plus to the limit on the maximum number of Frostbomb, and this is only works if you have plus limit, by the way, you can do things like echo it. So if you echo Frostbomb, what happens is you get a second Frostbomb that casts at the same time as the original, and you see I got 2 explosions, and I get 2 infusions. If you utilize spell Cascade, Cascade will make 2 smaller versions of Frostbomb on the left and the right, and those will also create infusions, which means that you can potentially get a total of 3 infusions from Frostbomb at that particular time period. And you can combine together Spell Echo and Spell Cascade for a total of 4 Frostbombs, which essentially allows you to get 4 infusions any single time you're using it. This also means that you get a lot more pulses, which means you can stack up that exposure much faster on a monster than you would otherwise normally be able to. In fact, if we go into a map real quick, and see if we can find any monster. Doesn't really matter. And I utilize Frostbomb on these monsters. You'll notice that the exposure, which is right here at the top, is stacking up extremely fast, and now I have 75% exposure on these particular targets, which is a pretty massive amount of exposure, and then I can hit them with a very large cold attack, which does a massive amount of damage, right? So Frostbomb is really good for a lot of reasons. Number one, it's very easy to add into builds for exposure. If you have the intelligence requirement to actually utilize the high level version, then you can put this into basically any character. Another way that you can potentially satisfy the intelligence requirement is utilize things like this. Adaptive capability on the Gemling Legionnaire gives you attribute requirements of gems can be satisfied by your highest attribute. You notice that my character has 228 strength, but I only have 36 intelligence, which means that when you look at this gem and it says it requires 147 intelligence, well, I don't have 147 intelligence. It's being satisfied by my strength requirement, so I can find ways around the intelligence requirement, and I can also, of course, have the intelligence requirement one way or the other. Now, Frostbomb has an exposure limit of 8 seconds, so you do want to make sure you refresh it before it finishes. The cooldown on it is only 6 seconds, so spamming it is pretty easy. You can get maximum exposure basically with this setup by just simply having multiple bombs explode. You can also get the maximum number of infusions. So what can you spend your infusions on? Well, there's a lot of various things that you can spend infusions on. In fact, if you go and you take a look at PoE2DB elemental infusions, you can come up with a list of various things. Spark can consume a cold infusion to fire many sparks in a circle. You can also get lightning warp. In fact, let's just type in cold infusion so we can light these up for us. So Frostbomb, of course, makes cold infusions. Orb of Storms makes a lightning infusion. You can potentially utilize it on frost darts to cause if each possible projectile to lodge into the enemy and explode. That one's actually really good. I tested that one for a while. Ice Nova consumes a cold infusion to leave patches of chilled ground, which is pretty powerful for specific abilities. Basically just gives you the ability to get a bunch of chilled ground, extra damage on spark, extra damage on frost darts, and so forth and so on. And you can also use elemental infusions to just gain damage. So like there are abilities like on the passive tree that have to do with infusions. If you just type in infusion, and you'll see different ones that will give you like increased elemental infusion duration. There's also ones that give you damage while an infusion is active. Yeah, 15% increased spell damage if you've consumed an infusion recently. 15, 10. Skills have 5% chance not to remove elemental infusions, can count as consuming them. So you can basically set up your character around infusions, get more cold infusion like bonuses, and also This one in particular is pretty cool. Gain a power charge whenever you consume an elemental infusion. That one's actually really cool. Infusions are remnants. They're technically in the remnant category. Remnants have a lot of various things that you can do with them. So if you search for remnants, there's another couple up here. This one allows you to create fire infusions instead of cold infusions. So you could make Frostbomb generate fire infusions with elemental equilibrium. That's rather interesting. But if you type in remnants, I think it's remnants. I can't remember exactly how to spell it. Remnants. There it is. Remnants. And remnants are basically the same thing essentially as infusions, so they count as infusions. And so there's a lot of buffs on here that you can potentially get, like 15% chance for remnants you create to grant their effects twice. That one's kind of cool. You can also get a bunch of them that allow you to collect them from further away. I'm not exactly sure how many of these you would actually build into with this though. Because the more you build into like being able to collect them from further away and stuff, like the less you're building into damage. But there's also things like recover 3% maximum life whenever you collect a remnant, recover 3% maximum mana whenever you collect a remnant. And there's more, of course, than just infusions. Like there's remnants that you can get all over the place for various different classes. A lot of things classify as remnants. I wonder if it actually specifically states if I click on it. Remnants are lingering objects in the world which are generally created by players. Walking over remnant collects it, grabs bonuses. It doesn't specifically state everything that classifies as remnant. Overall, Frostbomb is an amazing addition to honestly just about any build. Not only does it add a huge amount of exposure, which is multiplicative damage to basically any elemental build, you can utilize it for infusions, to get the cold infusions. You can also use it for the actual damage, too. I actually set it up for damage once, and the damage isn't actually half bad. You can set up the different nodes on it to give you longer or shorter explosions. If you're going specifically for exposure, one of the support gems that I would recommend is Long Fuse. Long Fuse essentially makes it so that the detonation time is 70% longer, but at the same time it deals more damage. You don't necessarily care too much about the damage part of it, as you do the fact that when you use it, if you use the Long Fuse, you get more pulses. So the more pulses that you get, the more times it's applying that exposure, and essentially just allows you to make sure that you're applying as much exposure as you can during the duration of the ability. Short Fuse would probably be better if you were trying to use it for damage, because the skill doesn't do any damage while it's applying exposure. It only does damage on the actual explosion. So if you use the Short Fuse version is going to give you a much better damage output, because you're going to be able to get a lot more detonations off in that time period, which means just more damage in general. So if we use Short Fuse, you'll notice it's just going to go off really quickly, and we can get the explosions almost instantaneously, right? Which is way, way faster than the long detonation. And there's a lot of various ways that you can potentially manipulate this to your benefits, either increasing or decreasing the time, increasing or decreasing the exposure amount, and just using it for your benefit. The size of it can also be manipulated as well. So if you use things like Magnified Area, Magnified Area will give you a pretty big explosion. In fact, this is just Magnified Area 1. But let's put Magnified Area in here so you can see how much larger it looks as a result. As you can see, it covers most of the screen when you use Magnified Area. If you're going for damage, you would probably go for the opposite, which is Concentrated Area. Concentrated Area makes the entire thing obviously much smaller and less, obviously exposure, way less, as you can clearly see. It's much smaller bombs, but they're going to do more damage, right? So in general, when you're talking about like the damage output of Frostbomb, if you want to try and build that, there definitely are some very interesting ways you can get a lot of damage out of Frostbomb. And of course, spamming it gets you tons of infusions. Another good reason for you to use the Short Fuse instead of the long fuse is for the infusions, right? So if I'm trying to get infusions quickly and I just want my infusions on the table right now, obviously the short fuse is going to get me the most infusions the quickest, and I can just have like basically an infinite number of infusions for my spells. To give you an idea of what it looks like when you use one of the infusions, let's do that real quick. I do believe I have a Nova spell here. I was playing around with Nova at some point. Nova is a good one to show it off with. So let's go ahead and throw Nova in here for a second. So we generate our infusions, and when you generate the infusions, you'll notice down here in the bottom that the ability has this like purple kind of circle on it, indicating that it is infused. And then when you use it, you'll see that it's a much different version than the regular version because it's infused. Right? So like that's the infused version, and this is the non-infused version. So let's go over here so you can see the non-infused version. It's a much smaller ability. It doesn't have the chilling ground attached to it. Like, it's far less impactful, right? But when we use the infusions on the ability, and let's go ahead and grab some infusions again, you can clearly see that we have a much larger explosion. And not only do we have a much larger explosion, but we get the chilled ground in it as well. And you could utilize abilities that make that chilled ground much larger, like encroaching ground or persistent ground are two support gems that come to mind that would be very effective here. So like if you were to utilize I believe encroaching ground, let's just type in ground. And we're looking for, yeah, encroaching ground is really interesting. It basically makes the ground surfaces grow. So in this particular case, you could obviously grab your infusions and you could utilize your effects, which is of course going to put your ground down. And notice that the ground is actually growing now, and it's covering like almost the entire battlefield. So I hope I've been impressed upon you the crazy things that you can do with Frostbomb. Make sure that you actually have Frostbomb leveled up to the appropriate level, otherwise the exposure will not affect the target. This is something that you do have to keep in mind with Frostbomb, is make sure that you keep the level of the ability increased so that the exposure actually does apply to the targets. Otherwise it's not going to apply at all. Customize it to the way that you need it, otherwise it's not going to be very useful. Like, don't just use basic Frostbomb. Get it customized to how you're trying to set it up. Do you want infusions? We'll set it up for infusions. Do you want to set it up for, you know, like exposure? Then set it up for exposure. Are you trying to use it for damage? Then use it for damage. There's a lot of ways that you can potentially customize the way that Frostbomb works and, you know, like mold it into your build, essentially. As always, I do appreciate you guys and gals watching. Be sure to hit that like button and subscribe button if you enjoy the content. And as always, keep watching.